All right, Matty Martin, appreciate you coming on again, brother.
Good to see you.
Today, got many questions revolving around Christianity. I'm still on my journey, definitely understanding more about the Bible, the church, the Mass, pretty much everything there is about Christianity. And brother, you're a mentor to me in a way when it comes to asking me difficult questions. And that's why I'm excited to have you back on. We did one last year, and we also did one with both Atlas and Father Ashwin last year as well. The first question I want to kick out the park is, why does Catholicism seem to be the most evident true religion in today's world?
Yeah. So I love that question, because obviously, to choose a religion is a daunting task, I guess. And in the same aspect as choosing anything, it is to reject the other things, which can be a very sensitive issue. So I just want to say from the outset that I'm just a normal person. I don't have any academia. I'm not a scholar or a priest, so I'm just speaking from my own perspective. And I don't assert myself as above anyone else. I think we all start with finite knowledge and finite willpower to do good. And from there, we just try our best to figure it out. But I'm happy to speak on how I chose Catholicism. And I'm happy to say that one of my highest guiding principles in the journey was to find out what appears to me to be the most true. And I think that's a very good way to discern a religion, is to say, well, which one's true? I can go down my path a little bit, like how did I get there?
Yeah, definitely touch on that.
So I just had a sense that things weren't right. I was a full-blown atheist, right? And I had a sense that something's not right, because we live in a world where we're super wealthy. Like if you compare us to history,
Yes,
we are so wealthy, and we don't really lack knowledge. We don't really lack education. Like education now is, so many people go to university, it's like, 17, 16 years plus of education. That's a lot of investment into education. We've got information at our fingertips, phones, internet, everywhere we go. So much information, you could never get through it in a lifetime. So we don't lack access to information or access to resources. And then I look around and I'm like, is all of the good reflected in the culture and the community? And I see the community going backwards in several metrics, and I couldn't understand how that could be, because I was operating with the principle of, kind of humans are a good thing, and like we know what's right and we do what's right, and if we could just get this next thing, we could make it work. If we could just figure out this next problem, a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more research, it'll get better. But if you look at the timeline, it doesn't really follow that well. And I'm thinking of things like male-female relationships, the way kids are being raised, mental health. I don't feel like that was constantly getting better. Now, that's not to say some parts of it are definitely getting better. But on a whole, there was a lot of suffering, and some of the suffering seemed to be unexplainable from a point of, we've got so much resources and information, how do we get to the bottom of that? And I met Father Ashwin, and I went down that track. My wife was a Protestant at the time. I went to her churches, asked a few questions. We went to a few different Protestant churches, spoke to a few different people, a lot of good people. And I was just looking for answers, and that search is very deep, and you're not going to get quick, easy answers. You're dealing with a kind of like a lens to see life through that is accurate. I like the concept of, when you think about mathematics, it's abstraction. So you can't touch mathematics, but yet mathematics makes so many things possible or better. And it's that kind of abstract lens that I get with Christianity that is so subtle and so powerful. Obviously, it's not black and white like mathematics, but there is so many patterns that you can see recurring. So yeah, I guess I went down that pathway and I kept asking questions and digging. I knew nothing. I knew nothing about church history. I knew nothing about, schisms in the church, different sects of Christianity. I was totally new to all of it. And I knew nothing really of, I knew minimal things about other religions like Hinduism, Buddhists, Islam, etc., Judaism. So yeah, it was kind of like, well, I know something's missing. I feel like there might be something here. I'm getting a hint that there's something here in religion. Because if you look at the Western civilization, it's pretty much built on Christianity. Like, it used to be called Christendom. And obviously we've moved away from Christianity in the Western world, particularly in the last, 30, 40 years. And that's been like slowly sliding away, and then it's had like an accelerating effect. It seems like now there's more people going back towards Christianity, but we definitely had a big slide. I think we've gone from like 90-something% of the population down to like 60% of the population being identified as Christians. Yeah. So, and obviously within that, some people are in name only, like they were baptized Christian, but they don't practice. So yeah, and you can correlate some of these patterns of, I guess, a lot of it's relational. So like that male-female relationship really is at the key, and it's so important. It doesn't, like, if you think about this is a good question. If you think about, you can have all the information and all the money and all the resources and all the things in the world, but you're alone. You're the only person on the planet. It's not really what anyone wants. So I think that puts things into quite a quick perspective. So most people kind of take a lot for granted. Like, yeah, we know what love is and we know how to love, and it just happens. And they've kind of got a little bit of a romantic kind of notion of. I talked to a few people recently, some friends of mine and some people that I come across at work and stuff, and they were gracious enough to give me some insight on how they seen it. And it's almost like a chance game for them, where they hope someone shows up sometime and it just clicks. And they feel like it's out of their control. They feel like there's nothing that they can do to find a good relationship. And that's a pretty hard place to be when you consider that if people don't come together and have children, there's no humanity. And we really take that for granted. Like, that process it's simple to get a child, but it's very difficult to raise a child. And if you don't raise a child well, the future is in trouble. So that's kind of the lens I was like digging and digging and digging. Yeah, and so that's going to bring us into 1,000 theological questions and historical questions, and you get right deep into the weeds. And it's a 2-year process. Trying to sum it up quickly is very difficult. But for me, a big thing was, okay, well, where do we start? Well, I like the uncaused cause, which is an argument about the Big Bang Theory, the singularity. We started with matter, energy. We started with things. Even in the physical sciences, we started with things. And it's like, well, in physics, it's kind of like you can't get something from nothing. That's why they can't go back before the singularity. I guess that's not really technically correct, but where did that matter come from? Is that matter eternal? That doesn't make sense, because we know through all science has proven, it's not proven, but it's pointing towards the universe had a beginning. If there was no universe at some, I guess you can't even use time. It's a confusing thing to speak of, because time, energy, space, matter all comes into the singularity, but it has to come into somehow, right? And there's all these theories about, the multiverse and all this sort of stuff. And I find that doesn't matter if you go multiverse, because you just kick the can down the road. Something has to be eternal. So I like the best argument I found is the uncaused cause. There has to be something that's eternal that has brought into existence matter, energy. And then whatever that thing is eternal and obviously all powerful. And then if you look at the next layer, if you accept that as a principle, you look at the next layer and you look at the universe being in incredible balance. You can't even go into description of all of the different constants that need to be so precise as to allow life, from the strong nuclear force, how atoms and molecules are held together and evolve around each other and repel each other and attract each other at just the right amount. It's mind-blowing. That all those constants have to be dead spot on, then gravity, then speed of light. All of these things are critical to life on Earth. And the chances of them happening are unfathomable. The number is so big, you couldn't write it in a book type thing, 1000, page after page after page. So I was like, well, that can't be an accident. It can't be random things bumping into each other. That doesn't make sense to me. And I like an analogy. I've heard an analogy, and it's like if you put, say, a criminal against this wall and you have 50 top marksmen line up and he's going to get executed, and they all 50 marksmen shoot and they all miss, do you believe that was a random chance? Because that's way more likely than us being alive on Earth. So I was like, I'm convinced that there was a lot of arguments there. There's a lot more to it. I can't get into all of the details. But if you look into the mathematics, you look into the other scientific arguments, people talk about simulation argument, multiverse. It's like none of that fits at all. And the evidence for that is so much lower than the evidence for the Christian religion. And you know what? I see a extreme skepticism against religion in the general culture. And you don't have the same skepticism for other things. Like I know a bunch of people that are like, they believe in aliens. Most people would say, oh, there's aliens out there somewhere. We might not have found them yet, but there would be there. Really? What's your evidence for that? Oh, it's just a big universe. Surely it's got to be there. Okay. I understand that logical premise, but that logical premise is nowhere near as strong as the logical premise for the Christian God. Nowhere near as strong. Yet they reject that, and they're completely like staunch about rejecting it. So yeah, for me, it was like fine-tuning argument was massive. Uncaused cause argument was massive. So I knew there was something that was eternal, all-powerful, and kind of had a point, a purpose. Obviously, something that's all-powerful, that is eternal, brings something into existence. It's not an accident. So it's like by design. So then it's like, well, how can we know more? So I went down the natural law. You can learn a lot about natural law through the ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and stuff like that. He was incredible. But you can't know, I found in my experience, it's very difficult to know God unless God reveals himself. And, the Jewish religion has a lot of God revealing himself slowly, but it's through things like prophets and through things like certain experiences. These are all in the Bible, things like the burning bush, Moses and the burning bush. But they're all like super subtle, and the biggest, most obvious one of God, of a claim of God revealing himself is Jesus Christ. Because in that claim, it's God came to become man. And that claim is unlike any other in history that I'm aware of. And I can't find any claim in any other religions where they're like, God became man and walked among us on earth. And we have his words in a book. So that's a big claim. Now, the evidence for that is, I guess, somewhat circumstantial, but there's a lot of it. And I like this idea of convergence of evidence. It's like if you've got a bit of evidence here, and they're all pointing to the same thing, it starts to build up, it starts to accumulate, it starts to be like, well, it makes a lot of sense, and it kind of fits with all of these other things. So then I was kind of like, well, Jesus kind of makes sense. And then I started to go, well, so we'll talk about Jesus real quickly. The biggest religions, things like, I guess Judaism is not a massive religion, but it was an old religion and it's still around today. They had so many prophecies, I think 300 or more, that all come true in Jesus. And they all agree Jesus lived and Jesus was killed for claiming to be God. But they see Jesus as not God, as just a crazy like rebel that claimed to be God and claimed to be able to forgive sin and things that only God can do. And then obviously the Christians believed in Jesus was God. And then the Muslims believed that Jesus was a prophet, and not just any prophet, but the second best prophet before Muhammad. So everyone kind of agrees that Jesus lived and was some notable person. So I've seen an analogy that says like Abraham Lincoln was the leader of the United States. It's as if someone in the 18th century that was just a random carpenter that was a bit weird, a bit crazy, had more things written about him and was remembered for a longer period of time than Abraham Lincoln himself. Because I can't remember the number, but it's like a magnitude more was written and known about Jesus than what was written and known about Tiberius Caesar, who was the leader of the largest empire on earth at the time, where Jesus was born within.
And
so,
you're referring to the Roman Empire there.
Yeah, the Roman Emperor, yeah. So I guess there's like layers and layers and layers. And then I was like, okay, so I'm going to go with Christianity because it's got the most believable story for me. And it fits with so many things. And you could probably probe into that a little bit and I might be able to articulate more precisely if you want me to. But so from there, I was like, well, there's a lot of different Christian denominations. And it's like, well, then it become a historical thing. Okay, so I'm going to go with Christianity. Which Christian sect, I guess, has the strongest claim to being the fullness of the truth, I guess is the best way to say it. It's not to say that the other people are totally wrong and et cetera, et cetera. And if, in fact, on that matter, I'm pretty sure that after Vatican II, the Catholic Church has an official teaching saying that there is truths in all other religions, or I guess in most other religions, there is some truths, and to varying degrees. Some religions may have more truth in them than others, but the claim is that the Catholic Church has the fullness of God's truth. So it's not to say, that's completely garbage and this is correct. It's not that high horse type thing. And yeah, so remember where we began, it's like we're human, we're totally fallible and we're trying to figure things out the best we can. And the Catholic claim just makes the most sense by a lot. And it's not just a logical thing, it's also backed up by bodies on the line. So if you look at the history of the apostles, you look at the history of the martyrs of the church, the Catholics have, and even today, the priests, they take a vow of celibacy. You look at the brothers, they take a vow of poverty, chastity, obedience. Like they literally giving their lives up for the religion. And I don't think people do that without a strong belief. And I know that's only social proof, but we use social proof for everything. We use social proof for where we want to go on holidays, what car we want to buy, which gym we want to train at, which restaurant we dine at. We're always using social proof. You see the concept of reviews, you know what I mean? And that social proof is so much easier and lighter or lesser than the social proof of I'm willing to die for my belief. You know what I mean? Like if you ask me, if you could go back and talk to a martyr, those martyrs are in situations where it's like, hey, renounce Christ or lose your life. And they're like, I refuse to renounce Christ. That's a strong testament to the faith. And it didn't happen once and it didn't happen in one place. It's happened for a large part of history. And I just think that's very strong evidence from a social proof concept. And same thing with priests. And there's priests and brothers and friars all over the planet, all different countries today, and all the way back for 2,000 years. People have just been giving their life for the belief. So if you want something that has social proof, it's pretty hard to find anything that comes close. And then there's the logical arguments. So I guess I can talk a little bit about the problem with Catholicism. I guess I can't say it's a problem, but I guess the risk is that it has an authority claim where one person is the head of the church. And obviously, we're all men and we're all human. We all have concupiscence or the propensity to do evil, which I'd love to get into soon. But so when a human has a lot of power, they have a lot of temptation to do wrong. So when you have an extreme authority, a lot of people get nervous about that. And they're like, well, don't make us do things that would be wrong. Do you know what I mean? And don't abuse your power. Does that make sense? So I guess that's the risk of Catholicism. But the beauty of that authority is that we can all be one and that we can have unity. And the other side of that concupiscence or original sin or the propensity to do wrong is things like pride. I want things my way. And I'm way more likely to believe me than you or anyone else. So it's like without that authority, we can be very easily divided and no one tells me what to do. Do you know what I'm saying? And that's what I found was the problem with some of the other sects of Christianity is it become extraordinarily divided. And over time, it's just more and more and more divided. And what they believe now in many sects of Christianity is not what their founders believed or remotely close to it. So
how many denominations are there standing today?
I've heard a lot of conjecture around this. There's big numbers thrown around that a lot of people push back on and say it's not fair. Big numbers like 30,000 Protestant denominations. A lot of people say that's not fair because it's kind of like people are in unity, but there's like subsects of the same kind of religion, but they're just like locally operated. Kind of like the concept of Gladstone has a local council, but it's within Australia. It's not fair to count all of the towns. Does that make sense? But I think the number is, I don't know, there's a lot, hundreds and hundreds, maybe over 1,000 when you get into Protestant denominations. Because Protestants' belief, their belief comes from Bible alone or sola scriptura, which means that what's in this book is like the ultimate truth. And there is not all Protestants believe this, but they all believe this is the ultimate truth. And then they have kind of a semi-practical, some of them have a semi-practical law, but a lot of them, especially the popular ones today, have Bible alone, which means this Bible has the ultimate truth. But the problem with that is it's my interpretation of the Bible and your interpretation of the Bible is different. So then we're at odds. I try to convince you, you try to convince me. If we're unable to convince each other of our own perspectives, we go our separate ways and we make our own church. And we're convinced like I've done more study than you or you've done more study than me, therefore I'm right. You fall into this error and then it just divides and divides and divides. Like that just repeats over time. And then in a response to that, some Protestant denominations go to, well, we're non-denominational. We don't have we don't have like a horse in that race. We just believe in Jesus. And they try to abstain from argumentative kind of, but I like the theologian Thomas Aquinas in history. He's like 1100s or 1200s or something like that. And he was very rational and he's really famous for his book, the Summa Theologia, which is very structured and regimented in like logic. And he's criticized for not being spirit-led and led by love. But I think those criticisms are not upheld in the text and when you look at his life. But trying to get to the point, Thomas Aquinas says, well, in order for me to love someone or something or God, I need to know them. It's difficult for me to love my wife if I don't know my wife. And in the same manner, it's difficult for me to love Jesus if I don't know Jesus. And it's difficult for me to love God if I don't know God. And then how do I know God? Well, I need to be in relationship with him, of course. All the Protestant denominations are correct with that part. But I also need to study him. I need to study history and the Bible and tradition, etc., etc. And I don't think that discarding other things helps me know him better. I don't know if I've said that very accurately. I've probably twisted myself in a bit of a knot there, but if you've got some context of what I'm saying, that will make sense. I'm happy for you to ask questions if I've lost you.
One question I definitely have is what came first, the church or the Bible?
Okay, that's a great question. So I would have to say the church came first, because I believe the church was started from Jesus when he initiated Peter the apostle as the head of the church. And he says, Peter, upon this, in the Bible, it says, Peter, upon this rock, I will build my church. He says, your name is Peter. From here on, your name is Peter, and upon this rock, I will build my church. And there's different, now it gets down to interpretation. To me, that is clearly, Peter means rock the word is Petros or Kephas in Aramaic or in Greek. And both of those words mean rock. And then he says immediately afterwards in the same sentence, upon this rock I will build my church. So to me, it's very clear. It's hard to get around that. It's a bit of a stretch. You might say he also meant something as well, but it's hard to say that he didn't mean that, but he meant something else. Does that make sense? So I believe the church started with the apostles, and I believe in apostolic succession. So you can see in the Acts of the Apostles examples of what happens when they need to hand on the faith to the next generation. You can also see it in when St. Paul is talking to Timothy. All of this is in the Bible. And there's examples of how they pass on their office, I guess you could say that, their authority or their duty, their obligations. And then you can also see it outside the Bible in church history and tradition. You can see Justin Martyr. There's a whole heap of what we would call church fathers or bishops of the early church. And many of them were practicing, and we have their writings, church fathers' writings, that were dated earlier than the first writings of the Bible. So I believe that, and we have it through the Judaic tradition. A lot of what they did back then was oral. Their spoken word was very, very profound, and they didn't have technology and, easy ability to write. They could obviously write, but only certain people could read and write, and everyone can speak to each other. So it was much more efficient to speak the word. And they were also, because they weren't so distracted with technology and higher education and all this sort of stuff, they were very good at memorizing spoken words. So a lot of people memorized the scriptures. Some of the early church fathers are famous for memorizing massive sections of the Bible. So from my experience and what I know, there was very widespread oral traditions of the spoken word in liturgy or in church tradition, where they would, breaking the bread and coming together and praising God and worshiping God and sacrificing. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So I think from that oral tradition, it was written down, and then they were circulated. But even when it was written down, it's still, that would have been a process of dissemination. And then after it was written down, they didn't agree on the Bible. It wasn't widely agreed upon of which books are in the Bible and which scriptures are in the Bible and which scriptures are not in the Bible until hundreds of years after Christ. So, yeah, I feel like it's very difficult to argue that the Bible came first. The church had to come first. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Another question I've got is, do you believe that, say, for example, we had Christianity and then Catholicism and then the Anglican Church, which is started by Henry VIII. Do you believe that that chain effect started by Henry VIII disagreeing with the Bible, that you can only marry once and you can't divorce? He disagreed with that and he modified Christianity to suit his needs. And then and everyone kind of jumped on that bandwagon. They're like, all right, I don't believe in this, so I'm going to modify it, and this is what was actually said and what should be.
Yeah. That's a very strong way to put it. I would have a lot of nuance to it. I would say that it's a very complicated situation. At that time, I guess we could probably, I don't want to get too much in the weeds on this. We're talking about the Reformation, so 1500s for a long time, 60 years or something like that. There was a lot of splits from the Catholic Church in all different directions. And obviously the Church of England with Henry VIII was one of the large splits. We know the Church of England as Anglicanism or Anglicans. But there was also many others. There was Switzerland and Germany with Martin Luther, and then later on there was Scotland with John Knox and obviously John Calvin, and there was a lot of different pulls away from the church, started to fracture, and there was problems before that, and there was problems. So before the Reformation, there was problems with the election of a pope, which made a little bit of, I guess, scandal in the church. And there was also problems, and this comes back to the risk of the one authority of the Catholic Church. There was also problems with how the Catholic Church was, I guess, taxing certain countries and kings, monarchs and stuff to be under or in the religion of Catholicism. Obviously, this is part of, I guess, I don't know how to articulate this, but this isn't directly part of the faith, but it's more about how the church operates on a day-to-day basis and like laws within the church, not necessarily of the faith though. And it's obviously very different now. But there was, I guess, political issues between countries and the church that shouldn't have been joined to the church, in my perspective, and I'm a nobody. And really, I feel guilty speaking on the matter. But I just want to paint the picture of the Reformation wasn't a one-trick pony or a one-problem thing. But what I would say is I can relate to some of the emotional feelings from some of those reformers, and I can see how they would feel justified in having a problem. But from my personal trying to be humble perspective, they should have gone different responses to those emotions and those problems that, could be genuine problems. I would have liked to have seen different responses to those genuine problems. And yes, I think you did hit the nail on the head when you start to say, well, I want to do it my way, not your way. That's division straight away. And when you're doing it your way, that's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. If you're going to lead the faithful and you're going to break away from the church, that's so much responsibility, especially when you see the tradition. Like we talked about social proof, there's like the test of time. So before the Reformation in the 1500s, there was so many what they would call heresies, which would be like small sections or sometimes larger sections of humans that might call themselves Christians that fell into an error, because obviously Christianity is extraordinarily complicated when you get into theology. It's very simple on the surface level to believe in Jesus, give your life to Christ and, repent of your sins and et cetera, carry your cross. It's relatively simple on a surface level. But when you go into the Bible, it's so deep and so complicated, depending on how deep you go. And some of these people believed things on a theological thing, like they might have believed, there's all sorts of heresies. Some of them believed in Pelagianism. I don't want to just throw out big words, but some of them believe that you could save yourself. You didn't need grace from God, that you could save yourself through works. Some of them, but that's a heresy, but people believe that. And then the Christians had to fight against those concepts. So there was breakaways and fights, and it just happened over and over and over and over and over again. And the Catholic Church stayed united and large and spreading all throughout all of those splits. And then there was a massive schism between the East and the West Catholic Church, which is what it would have been for the first 1,000 years or so. And that great schism was with our Eastern Orthodox brothers. And that schism was around two major issues that I know of, and I'm not an expert on this, but my layman understanding of it is they split because of the filioque, which is a fancy word. It's a theological difference in the creed. I think it's the Nicene Creed, which was we believe in the Father. The Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And they were like, no, it doesn't proceed from the Son. It only proceeds from the Father. I think that was a big disagreement. And from an outsider's perspective, they might think like, oh, well, you're getting in the weeds. Well, what's that pointer? But that's a big deal because it changes, like we were talking about before, how you know God. It's how you know the Trinity, which is the God 3 in 1. So it does change things. There's like ancient people knew that there would be flow-on effects if you adopted that belief. But I think a lot of those things, those differences have been not hashed out, but a lot of people have come to a much closer understanding of the same thing now. But there was a second issue, which was the papacy, which is the Pope, which is a Catholic authority. And for, like, we're all one church, but there was kind of like the papacy become the doctrine of I forget how the word is, but it's like the Pope used to be seen as, or this is the Orthodox claim, the Pope used to be seen as first among equals. Now, how you interpret that, I'm not an expert on, but the Pope always had this primacy position. But the claim from the Orthodox is that the Catholics changed it from primacy to supremacy, where he had infallibility. So what the Pope said, if he said it, and that's a big can of worms to open up. Not everything the Pope says and does is infallible, but he does have the capacity to speak in an infallible way, which obviously he would not do very often, and he would exercise extreme prudence in doing so. But that made the Orthodox Church uncomfortable, and they couldn't agree. They couldn't sign off on it. And the funny thing is, I don't want to get in the weeds on that. There is an argument around the Orthodox followed the Pope 500 years before that, but then after they got out of the council, I think it was the Council of Chalcedon or something like that, after they left the council, they didn't ratify it. They reneged on it. But anyway, I don't want to get in the weeds of that. I'll lead people into error. But just want to say that the Catholic Church has stood the test of time, and it has had issue after issue after issue, like people attacking it, people splitting from it, people arguing against it for well over 1,500 years, and still there. Does that make sense?
Mm. And still by far the greatest in numbers.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's like over 1 billion Catholics in the world. Protestants are growing fast, but I don't think it's a fair comparison to say Protestants and Catholics, because Catholics have one Pope and we all are united under one authority, whereas Protestants are all divided. And if you were to actually ask, well, what is the Protestant belief? They actually don't agree on any one belief. And the thing is, they don't have an authority to be able to say Protestants believe X. Does that make sense?
Yep. Because
nobody's the boss of the Protestants. They are their own authority.
Right.
Now, some Protestants have a very high view, and they agree that this is like the Anglicans. Some of the other ones, like Presbyterians and stuff like that, they have a very high view of what they call councils, where all of the ancient church bishops would come together and they would discuss issues and agree on issues. And if all of the bishops had a consensus and they all agreed on this issue, then it would be settled. Some Protestants hold that to a very high authority, and they say, well, we can't go against that because all the ancient Christians agreed. But other Protestants completely reject all councils. And some Protestants say if you don't agree in the Trinity, if you don't believe in the Trinity, you can't be a Protestant. But then there's Christians that would say they're Protestants that are Unitarianism, which they only believe in God the Father. They don't believe Jesus was God. So there's all sorts of fracturing, and there's no authority system except the Bible. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Have those denominations modified the Bible in any way, or they all refer to the same Bible?
Okay, so the Protestants have a different Bible to the Catholics and the Orthodox. And there was no Protestant. What the Protestants' version of the Bible is today, in the first 1,500 years of Christianity, didn't exist. There was no version of that Bible in liturgy, in use in church at all prior to the Reformation. But Martin Luther took certain books out of the Bible. And he didn't, to be fair, he didn't take them out of the Bible, but he challenged them and moved them to the back of the Bible. And he said, these things don't fit with the beliefs that I have. These books don't fit with the beliefs, with my theology and my studies. So I'm going to move them to the back of the Bible because I feel like they're not congruent with the rest of the Bible's message from my view. Does that make sense? As Martin Luther. And there was other Protestants that agreed with him and built off that. And obviously Anglicanism built off that, and John Calvin built off that. And yeah. So John Calvin, he started the Reformed Church or Calvinism, all these different sections of Protestantism. The funny thing is that Martin Luther himself believed in a whole bunch of Catholic dogmas that Protestants, the vast majority of Protestants, reject today. But Martin Luther was really the beginning of the Reformation. He was the founder of of Lutherans at least, but certainly of the Protestant Reformation.
To go like a step further, so obviously there's many denominations of Christianity and many religions like that. Many religions have different denominations that have occurred in like Islam. I know there's many versions. And you mentioned it before, I guess the Jewish, Muslims and Christians all believe in Jesus, but they all have a different point of view of who he was. So I guess the Jews believed he wasn't the Son of God. He was just a man going around spreading rumors, you could say, or lies. And then Islams believe, did they believe he was the son of God as well? No, he was just
prophet.
He was just a prophet.
Yeah,
Right.
But he wasn't just a prophet. He was the second highest prophet, only below Muhammad.
Right.
And so he was like, and they even believed in Mary being like the holiest woman, which was Jesus' mother. They have some strange beliefs, and I don't want to, I haven't studied Islam, so I'm way out of my depths here. But from what I know, I believe they think that Jesus didn't die on the cross, and they believe that Jesus was assumed to heaven bodily. They believe that there was some sort of trick on the cross where like somebody else died on the cross and they thought it was Jesus or something like that. I don't fully understand
They
it.
believe Jesus escaped. Isn't
Something
that
like that, yeah.
Yeah.
There's some sort of way whether it's like God made a copy of Jesus and made it look like he was going to die, or there was some sort of trickery on the cross where Jesus didn't die on the cross. I don't fully understand it, but anyway, Jesus couldn't die because he was too holy or something like that, and he was taken up bodily into heaven,
Right.
which totally changes the message of Christianity. Jesus says in the Bible, like, if you want to follow me, like, pick up your cross and carry it every day. Do you know what I'm saying? Which that message to me sounds like, if you want to live a virtuous life, suffering must be involved. Like, don't turn your back on suffering. Whereas if he didn't die on the cross, it's kind of like, to me, that's more, can't catch me, I'm a gingerbread man, I can get away with anything. It's a very different belief.
I think another strong reason too why Christianity stands above them all is it seems to be the most peaceful. You could say this might be tricky to I guess state, but Muslims seem to be a lot more violent. Like we can even see that throughout history. They tried to invade Europe, and even to this day, there still seems to be many acts of violence and terror. And then I guess before Jesus, everyone was Jewish, But after Jesus, everyone converted from Judaism to Christianity. And for me, for that mass of people to convert over to Christianity is just an extreme point of like how important Jesus was and the message he spread and the effect it had on people to be willing to just convert straight away. Like,
man, when it comes to, I want to actually get onto something in a second. Please don't let me forget it. I'd love to dive in here, but I want to talk about original sin, and I want to talk about the conscience, our conscience, and how it can convict us. I really want to get into that. But what you're talking about there is such a massive point about how important Jesus was. And if you take another view, let's say I'm an atheist. Let's say to me, Jesus was just like this whatever view I have. Maybe I think he was a good guy. Plenty of good guys in history, and Jesus is by far the most famous man on the planet in all history. And he was just a carpenter that, like, what did he do? If he didn't do any of if you reject all the miracles, what did he do? Why is he so famous? Why is the most famous, what is the most famous man in history famous for? If you reject the miracles and you reject the fact he's God. Well, he's famous for being a lunatic. He's running around saying, I can forgive your sins, and I can heal your sick, and I can, you know what I mean? It's like, I can walk on water, and I can raise the dead. So the most famous man in history is famous for being crazy. That's a strange belief. That then what follows from that? Are we all impressed by crazy people? Do you know what I mean? And if you look at how did Christianity spread? It spread under persecution, under extreme stress. These people were Christian at their own extreme risk of being persecuted, being killed, like they were in the underground for ages, hundreds of years, and it was spreading. And they had like secret signs. That's where that symbol of the fish comes from. You know, if you're a Christian and I'm a Christian, I just can't come up to you and say, hey, brother, are you a Christian? Because if you're not a Christian, I'm going to die. So people were very careful with how they dealt with each other. It was a very secret thing because the Roman Empire, who killed Jesus, were persecuting Christians. Same with the Jews. So you would draw this in the sand. You would draw like this symbol that went like that, and then which was just a curvy line in the sand. But if the other person was a Christian, they would draw it exactly in the other way to make the shape of a fish. So yeah, that's to say that, you know, people were spreading it and doing it and following it at great risk to themselves. And even today, man, like, let's be honest, if you want to be a genuine Christian, a Catholic, let's just talk about Catholicism. If you want to genuinely follow Catholic law, it's not, from the outset, as an atheist, it doesn't look super fun. Do you know what I mean? It's not like go and party and get rich and have a good time and like get a bunch of women. It's the opposite of that. It's, yeah, no sex before marriage. Huh? Like that hurts a young man. But yet people are still converting to Catholicism. So there must be something to it. And I had that issue. Do you know what I mean? Like, but that comes directly back to where I started, which is this problem between male-female relationships. We take so much for granted. We think it's easy. We think like, oh yeah, we can figure it out. You could maybe, but wouldn't it be smarter to take the wisdom of history and see what all of the ancients have learned about male-female relationships? Because somehow they've gone from caves to civilization. Hopefully they've learnt a bit along the way, and maybe we can get some of that wisdom from them. And the ones that were successful never had male-female relationships like we do today. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And we can see that today in today's social studies. You can see the amount of intimate partners people have had prior to marriage. That's correlated to success of the marriage. And you can also see people couples that live together prior to marriage has an impact on, like, a correlation through social studies on the success of the marriage. And that's all, like, Catholic law states all of that sort of stuff. You're not supposed to live together, and you're not supposed to be intimate with each other until you're married. We call the marital act, which sounds crazy from a current culture, but the social science of today backs up that it's very beneficial, and history backs up that it's successful. Do you know what I mean? So I guess that's kind of leads me to where I want to go. I want to talk about I'm reading this book a few weeks ago. I love the beauty of Catholic history is there is so many very wise men that have written their experiences down and their wisdom, like their perspectives down. And I'm reading this book from G.K. Chesterton, who's not that ancient. I think it's like 200 years ago or less. And in his book, he says that scientific men like to begin with facts and talk about facts. And the religious man begins with the fact of original sin, which can be seen on every single street corner in every city all over the world. And I'll try to expound on that because I realize some of the audience doesn't understand what is meant by original sin. But what original sin kind of gets at is the fall of man. It's the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, the disobedience of God, eating the forbidden fruit. They fell out of the Garden of Eden and they were cursed in a certain way, and that was original sin. Or I don't want to butcher it, but essentially the propensity to do evil, this kind of inclination to do things that are not good for us or for others. And I find that's a fact that you pretty much have to accept. I can't understand an argument that would say, no, people don't have an inclination towards doing anything bad. And that can be on many levels, right? It can be very light, like low level. I'm not trying to say evil is like the worst things possible, but I mean like low level stuff like eat too much of certain things or stay up too late or spend too much time on social media but other things too, which is like, not being honest, not doing the right by your wife or your kids. All of these not doing the right things in business, kind of swindling, you know what I mean? Fraud and things like that. So I think there's so many different levels of that we would call concupiscence, which is this appetite for doing the wrong thing. I think you have to admit that. Like, it's just patently true in everyone I've ever met to different levels. And if you accept that fact and how do you explain it? Is that an evolutionary advantage? I can't imagine that it could be. So how do you explain it? And I think that's super difficult to explain. And the Bible story maps onto it perfectly, maps onto my personal experience and what I see patterns in everyone around me. Absolutely perfectly. And if you dive into it about the 7 deadly sins and the heavenly virtues and the theological virtues, it all kind of goes, all the screw holes line up, just chung, 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 chung. It's like, whoa, that makes so much sense. But outside that, it's like, well, how do you explain it? Have you heard any good explanations for that? Or do you think people would reject the concept of the propensity to do wrong? Or how would you see the culture push back on that position?
Sorry, elaborate a little bit more. Why would people push back on the idea of
all humans having the propensity to do evil or the propensity to do things that are not good for them or people around them? Does that make sense?
No, I'm kind of a little bit lost. So do people believe in, I'm just trying to digest the question and how I answer it. Do people believe in like good and evil in a way, or
No.
No?
I want to talk about it like this. I'm a human, right? And I have day-to-day choices. And sometimes I choose things like that are not good for me. Why, if I'm a rational being, why would I choose things that are not good for me?
Right. I guess we live in a world today full of distractions
Okay.
that grab our attention. A lot of us seek comfort and pleasure over suffering and sacrifice. And I guess people know that they shouldn't be doing, say, X or Y, would be watching Netflix or, even a big one like masturbation. No one knows. Everyone will agree that masturbation is not good for you, but we still pleasure ourselves with that.
You know what I find? I want to dig into that. I want to push back on that. I don't think everyone would agree with that, because I've seen doctors, like health professionals, say, prostate health, it's good for you. You know what I mean? So I would agree with what you just said. 100%, it's really bad for you, specifically on like a philosophical, theological like lens. It's really bad for you. And you can go down like a humanitarian view of what's happening on the other side of the screen as well. But I've seen people like health professionals advocate for it. And I know people that would be ashamed of doing it, but wouldn't think it was wrong. It's a weird position. It's a weird place we are. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's certainly, I guess, by this culture accepted on some level. Would you say or no?
Yeah.
But I agree with you that most people with a little bit more sense of dignity would say that it's wrong for you. It's not good for you. Yeah. But you're kind of getting what I'm saying. It's that temptation. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I know this is not good for me, but I want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm talking about, concupiscence. Why do we have this appetite for going into being temptation? Does that make sense?
I think a lot of people are definitely, obviously it's very well known today, especially being young, especially young males that go through puberty and they start want to, become more physically attracted to females. They hear their mates talking about this thing online where you can watch, adult pornography. They experiment. It's a very overwhelming experience and very high dopamine experience. And then I guess that's when it kicks and they want more and more and more. And we can see in many males that they just fall down this rabbit hole of always seeking high dopamine and actually not realizing what true dopamine is, which could be as simple as running a marathon or, fighting like in combat sports, and actually achieving real, I guess, both physical and even like you say studying, so mental as well. True dopamine. A lot of people are taking the easy path of quick and easy dopamine, which is things like pornography and Netflix. And
yeah, I think I like all those points and I agree with those points. But I want to make it deeper than just chemistry, because dopamine is like a endorphin kind of thing. It's like a chemical in your brain that connects to a certain receptor. But I think the issue is certainly related to that, but bigger than that. And even if you accept it's just that chemical thing, why would it be an evolutionary advantage to do those things? Does that make sense? If we look at like the world, we're obviously the dominant species on the planet by quite a massive margin. So if you believe in the evolutionary sciences, like purely materialistic worldview, how do you say, well, we do all this stuff that's not good for us, and that's somehow given us the advantage over our other species? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
yeah.
And I think the original sin story maps onto it the best, because you're saying people do this for this reason, this dopamine response. Why do we have that dopamine response? Do you know what I mean? And I think it's bigger than, here's an example, bro. We don't need to have the access to that illicit material that makes that dopamine response, but we've created that illicit material. There's a market for it. Does that make sense? So I think that's a massive amount of evidence that we have concupiscence in humans. We want to do things that are bad for us. Which it's like this appetite for evil. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
So I'm trying to explain, how do you explain why humans have an appetite for evil? If without the biblical story, which I think is the perfect explanation of it, but if you reject the biblical story, how do you explain that appetite? Like, did we evolve to love to do things that are bad for us? And how does that help us be the dominant species on the planet? Am I making any sense?
Yes. I guess a lot of people seek power these days, which is one of the greatest acts of evil when you have immense power and you use it for bad. So there's the argument about power. A lot of people want attention over others, and they believe that when they receive more attention, that they are more valuable than, say, others who are not so, you could say, famous or well-known.
Can I don't know, if you've got some.
Please, if you can add.
What you just talked about reminds me of Aristotle, and he talks about the good life. It's not a great translation, but it's like, ultimately, what are we striving for? And he had 3 categories, and he had like the lowest category of what we're striving for is essentially hedonism or pleasure and comfort. So we're striving to feel good. And that we strive to feel good through our appetites, through our passions, pleasure and comfort, like basically dopamine. And then he had the next level up, which was, he called it like the political life or seeking honor. But that could be things like fame or power. That would be the next level up from the hedonist. Power, fame, influence, attention, what you're kind of getting at. And then he had the next level up, which was the contemplative life. And Aristotle actually had his own version of the virtues, which was contemplating, how we're here, what we're here for, good and evil, and trying to understand the world. And he said that when you get joy from contemplating, that's the ultimate good life. And I think that we can understand Aristotle best through the Christian lens. Obviously, Aquinas is super famous for synthesizing the Greek view with Christianity. And yeah, I guess we're getting a bit off topic there, but I definitely think that question of what is the good life is at the forefront of our culture. Like, it needs to be asked at a deeper level. And I don't think it's obvious what the answer is. And you know what? This will probably touch on, the studies around delayed gratification. I know you're very well aware of them. How could you delay gratification ultimately? And I would answer, prolong gratification until after you're dead.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you prolong gratification until after you're dead, that's directly in line with the Christian story. So that's another kind of convergence of evidence for me. You know how we talked about like all of these different things kind of lining up and pointing to one thing? There's just too many of them, man. And that's why I wanted to get into conscience. So eventually along my journey to why Catholicism, as I'm learning these laws, some of them are rubbing up against me like, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I agree with that, because it's taking away from me a pleasure. I feel like I'm being robbed, you know what I mean, on a surface level. But then as I look deeper and I accept it and I like follow it, it actually feels way better. And it's the same kind of thing as discipline. When you're disciplined and you live like a regimented life of whatever it is, whether it's study or physical training or, going to bed at the right time. Sometimes you want to stay up and party or stay up and you're interested in something, you know what I mean? But if you're disciplined, you go to bed, you wake up the next day, you feel better and you're happier for it. So it's that kind of concept of being disciplined. And all of the church teachings have been like that. You might feel like, oh, I'm missing out on something. I'm losing access to a good.
Yeah, FOMO.
But exactly, yeah. But when you do it, you're like, oh, that's way better. That's way better. But I would never have been able to believe that until I followed it. So yeah, and that's like the marriage laws, the chastity laws, all of these things, which I think are directly related to the struggle. Like, man, that we got to own up and admit the male-female relationships in our culture are suffering in a very significant way, and our children are suffering. And I believe, like, my conscience tells me that every child has a right to be born into a loving family, and that is, like, if we accept the fact that all rights have responsibilities, like, you can't have the right unless I have a responsibility. And we can make that super grotesque and obvious. Like, for me to have the right to life, you have to have the responsibility to not kill me. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So if we say that every child has a responsibility to be born into a loving family, then that means everyone that's becomes a parent has a responsibility to be in a loving relationship, love their children, love their wife, think that the child is a good thing. Do you know what I'm saying? That's basic Christian teaching, and it fits straight into my conscience. Like, oh, it's like coming home. Like, the more you learn, for me, the more I learned about Catholic law, the more I was like, oh, this feels good. That's right. Like, there's a sense of it. And so St. John Henry Newman has this saying where he talks about the conscience being the Aboriginal vicar of Christ in the human soul. So it's like we all have, and all Christians would agree, we have this relationship or this direct connection to God. And they would talk about things like that still small voice in your head when you're quiet and you're listening and you're attentive. So all of Catholic law kind of lined up with my conscience. And as I'm stop being so busy, stop being so distracted, actually have time where I sit with my thoughts and contemplate and listen and reflect. The more I do that and the more I learn about Catholic teaching, the more I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But people don't like to do that in our culture. They like to stay busy, you know, consuming. They don't see themselves as contributors or being creative. They see themselves as consuming. What can I consume next? Content, food, you know, entertainment. Let's go. Give me something. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is that there's so many layers that all pointed me to Catholicism. And we can talk about specifics. But yeah, I guess I've made a decent point there.
I guess even for myself, why I went in the direction of Catholicism it was a very pure way to live life and a way of life that seemed the most healthy for myself. Like when you practice Catholicism too, I guess you can say even like Exodus 90, when you contribute to Exodus 90, like you come out of that 90-day period feeling like you're in great shape, your headspace is a lot clearer. And that's purely because you're fasting on Wednesday and Fridays. You're talking to a group of men who are like-minded, who are very peaceful. You're not listening to music other than holy music. And that's another big thing today is we are so consumed by music, like it's everywhere. And a lot of people's, I guess, perspectives have been shaped by music, the lyricals that they hear, especially in like rap and that, like the way they talk about women, and it's crazy how a lot of these rappers claim to be Christian and believe in God, but the way I guess they sing, or the lyrics they use in their songs are just completely against the beliefs of God and Christianity. So it's for me, Christianity just seemed like this place where I could become the man I wanted to become.
Yeah. There's definitely part of that for me, but I'm trying now. I don't know. There's a lot of places I want to go with what you just said. So part of it is, you know, we're all human, and even when we're Christian, I'm still a sinner and I still have that appetite for evil. But now I've got, I guess, an acceptance that that's a thing and that it's still evil, even though I want to do it sometimes, or I'm tempted to do it. It's still evil. So I can't justify it. And I've got some tools that are somewhat effective against it. Do you know what I mean? Like prayer and just the contempt, like way more tools against it. Whereas when I was an atheist, it was way easier to like justify it because you got to see yourself as a good person. I don't think I have met people that have told me they don't see themselves as a good person, but it's exceedingly rare, and it's certainly not a healthy place to be, to see yourself as not a good person. And I think most people would see themselves as a good person, but when they do things that they feel a little bit condemned for doing, a very easy turn for those people that don't have a concrete foundation is to justify that evil and be like, oh, it's not that bad, or everyone else does it, or do you know what I mean? So I think that's another beauty which I haven't touched on about Catholicism, which is that objective morality. It's like, hey, I know you want to weasel your way out of a bunch of things, but you're not. This is the truth, and you can't make excuses for it. This is just what it is. You can butt your head against it if you want. It's not going to be very good for you, and you're not going to change anything. And I think that was very good for me too. But the other thing I wanted to go with what you said about how being a Catholic feels like it's good for you, I would agree. But I think we need to go a step a little bit further down the line and say, really, if I believe that the universe was created by God, then I shouldn't be doing this for me. I should be doing this in love for the Creator, because hopefully I believe that life is good and that it's a gift and that I'm grateful to be alive. And I think without that view, it's hard to raise children. If you don't think life is a good thing, it's hard to raise a child. Because why would you, that question, and I've heard people say this, why would you bring a child into this world? Those people struggle to see life as a gift. They see life as pain and suffering, and they see as, and I guess that's a big thing in Catholicism, is I see suffering can have a role in redemption, can have good come out of it, can help you to become more virtuous. And I guess I accept that trying to become more virtuous in cooperation with God's grace is a pretty big role of what we're here for. So what I'm trying to say is, yeah, I don't want to be Catholic for me, even though it is good for me. I kind of want to be Catholic because I think life is a gift, and I think it's absolutely awe-inspiring to think about how life exists on this planet, given all the scientific knowledge we have, all the natural law that we have. If I believe that was designed and created by God, then I want to be showing as much gratitude as I can through love and worship. Not that I can do much to the Creator, you know what I mean? But I think in worshiping God, that is good for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One thing I forgot to add is like, I think I've told you the story, is obviously I went to Chanel High School in Gladstone, and then that's when I was first really exposed to religion and God, and then I started following a little bit about it, and then I started believing in God. But again, that fear of, we live in Australia, a lot of people tend to be atheists and don't believe in the idea of a higher power. Just being that young person, just had that fear of, I guess, claiming that I believed in God, and I didn't go any further and didn't explore anymore. And then it wasn't until, I guess, certain events happened in my life that I wanted to, I guess, go down the Christian journey of finding more about what is God and what is the church and the Bible and everything about it. And then along the journey, I've had those experiences of having a more clear mindset, more clarity again around the purpose of life, and yeah, really understanding like everything you've elaborated on. Just like it's just so difficult to not believe in God.
Yeah, I had exactly the same experience, and that's beautiful. And I think the last thing I want to do is discourage anyone that's on the journey. Like it took me a long time, several years, to get to where I am now, and I'm certainly not criticizing anyone that's on their journey in a different point to what I am. Keep going. And if I can encourage you, I'd love to encourage you. I think it'd be great to link some videos in the description to some great resources that we have online. But yeah, what you're saying, I felt as well. So like big struggles for me was like marriage. In today's current culture, you see so much brokenness and bitterness and divorce, and a lot of men really struggle after divorce. And that's a real threat. And there's so much pain and suffering around that. So I was like, man, that's such a hard one to overcome. But the Catholic view is perfect. And you know what it's like? It's that this is a good example of coming home, because I had this hesitancy, even though I have a great woman in my life for a long time. I really felt this hesitancy to commit. But then when you understand the Catholic view of marriage, which is there is no such thing as divorce, you are married. You know, it says in the Bible, what God joined, let no man separate. So barring the exception of annulment, meaning that something was wrong in the marriage process where you weren't fully understanding what you were getting into, or something was done wrong in the sacrament, saying it's a valid marriage. If it's a valid marriage, no one can separate it because God joined you two together. So, you know, that could be suffering, and that could be, in worst case situations, some sort of living apart, but that can never be dating someone else. That can never be moving on. It's and you know, I think that makes total sense, because I liken it to being the captain of a ship at sea that goes down with the ship. And it's like, no, I don't abandon my ship ever, no matter what. Even when we're sinking, I'm staying with the ship. And that's in the vows of marriage anyway, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, and sickness and health, till death do us part. It's like super traditional, super normal. And I'm not saying it's easy. It's very difficult. But it's beautiful when people do it. It's beautiful. And to me, that's all the heroes. Everyone that you would say, oh, that's a beautiful heroic story, it's somebody that's done something very difficult for someone else, not for themselves. Like, I don't admire men that are like beating their chest, like, look what I did for me. That's kind of like not very attractive. In fact, for me, it's kind of repulsive. But, you know, it could be a war story. Somebody goes in some sort of leap of valor or courage, sacrificing themselves or putting themselves to death, or at least at great risk, to help other people that are in trouble. That's a very inspiring story. And same thing for couples that are married. If you show me a couple, and there's a few that I know of, that are married for 50 years, their children are grown up and successful, they have grandchildren, they're still together, they're still, you know, as much as you can say happily married, that's so inspiring to me, because I know it takes self-sacrifice and courage to get there. So I guess that understanding the Catholic view completely removed all of my anxiety around marriage. And now it's like, it doesn't mean that bad things won't happen in the future. It just means that suffering through those bad things is good for me. It really flips things on its head. It's not about poor me and what's in it for me. And I don't know how you get that understanding outside of religion. Like, I think outside of religion, people almost have like a business view of marriage. Like,
what do I get from this?
Yeah, like, let's have an agreement. We're going to come together and sign this contract, and you're going to do your end and I'm going to do my end, and you keep making my life better and you'll be able to stay around.
People look at it as like a welfare trade, that it's 50-50. Like, we give the same amount. If it's 60-40, like, something's going wrong and like you need to give more, but yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's a good example of how underlying beliefs that might even be below our conscious radar lead to such significantly different outcomes, and some of those outcomes are devastating. So just to give gravity to the importance of belief, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a religious belief, but for me, ultimately, it is religious belief. But it could be anything, you know, simple as sports psychology. If you believe that whatever you believe in, you believe you're not going to win the next match, that's going to have an impact on your performance in the next match. Like all of these beliefs have impacts on the outcomes. And that's why your ultimate, deepest beliefs are of the highest significance. And that's why I think you just can't reject religion, because how do you explain all of these factors? Like from an atheist perspective, what is love and why should we do it? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, where do you learn to love? Maybe you've been blessed with parents that were able to love, and maybe it's a tradition that's been passed down. Where did that start? Where did it come from? And how are you going to sustain it? Because I know a lot of, if you go back in history, a lot of us come from loving parents, but a lot of us aren't able to sustain that tradition in this generation, especially the next generation. You see it as brokenness everywhere. And that's critical. This, I guess, is a little bit political. But if you look at, I think they call it the age gap, something like that. It's like, if you look at how many 50-year-olds are in the workforce, it's a declining population, essentially. How many 50-year-olds are in the workforce today and how many people are being born today? In 20 years' time, the people that are born this year will be in the workforce and the 50-year-olds will be out of the workforce. And if the amount of people born this year are lower than the amount of 50-year-olds in the workforce, then the population is going to decline. The working age, the amount of people working are going to have to support more than one person that's in pensioner's age. So the economy collapses, and that's quite difficult to turn around. To sustain a population is kind of roughly 2.1 kids per person. But to rapidly increase a population, you have to go up in number quite a lot. And there's a lot of data I've recently looked into with this, and it's 50% of women that are 30 and not mothers don't ever become mothers.
Wow.
And I think that's very important, because a lot of women, I would say most women I speak to of that age, say they'll have kids, like of a young age, say they're going to have kids later in life, in their 30s. Like a lot of people are planning to do that. But if you look at the data, over half of women that enter their 30s that aren't mothers never become mothers. And more and more people nowadays are choosing to have no kids, which is, how do you sustain humanity? And that's that thing we take for granted. Oh, someone else will do it, or, we can figure it out, or that's common sense. People will get there.
It's crazy because having a family is almost the purpose of life. Like, what's the purpose of living if you're not going to recreate?
Yeah, I don't want to be that direct, but it certainly is. It should be part of most people's purpose. Do you know what I mean? And that's in the Bible. It says to populate the earth. So yeah, you're right. Like if we don't have sustainable birth rates, and if you look at the Western world, 75% of countries have a negative birth rate where they can't keep up. So that's why, and I was actually talking to someone recently that said, we've had governments on both sides that have been trying to limit immigration for 30 years and no one's ever been able to do it. And it's like, well, the population needs to increase. And if the country's not having enough kids, we need to have immigration to supplement that. Otherwise, where are we going to get the people to do the work? Yeah. So sometimes it's that hard story of, hey, we do kind of have a responsibility to our country to have kids if we can. Not everyone can, man. That's why I don't want to put that pressure on people. Like what would this kind of responsibility that we're talking about, it's heavy. It's like, that's a lot of responsibility. And that changes people's mindset, because most people are out there saying, go get rich and powerful and have a bunch of fun. Go acquire a bunch of assets and be the king. They're not talking about, hey, what's your duty? Do this, do that, do this. And you know what else, man? It's hard to get the concept of charity outside of religion too. I think the Aboriginal Vicar of Christ, our conscience, can make us feel empathy for people and give charity. But the responsibility of giving charity regularly isn't really anywhere outside of religion. Whereas in religion, we're supposed to give charity weekly. Like that's supposed to be part of our rhythm of life. Does that make sense?
I think a lot of people mistake charity too for you have to give money, but it can even just be giving someone the time of day for a conversation that they may need.
Yeah, charity can be seen in many different ways. Giving someone time, certainly, obviously, giving someone money, and I don't want to demonize that. I think charity giving money is a good thing, and people are very reluctant to do that. They want to hold on to their wealth. For me, but yeah, like I said before, we live in the richest time ever, and it's not doing us that much good. Like it's good to be comfortable, kinda, but it's not ultimately good. So most of us, some people are struggling, man. So it's hard to generalize. If you're really struggling to put food on the table and you've got a bunch of kids, and I'm not trying to make things harder on you or make you feel condemned at all. But in Australia, at least half the population could probably give a little bit of financial charity. But if you can't, man, 100%, there's 100 different ways to be charitable. Giving time, giving compassion, acts of service. Yeah. So how do you get that from an atheist perspective unless you have some organization put it in your face and make you feel guilty or convicted? Do you know what I mean?
Another big topic I want to touch on today is the Bible. I guess, how did the Bible come to be? Like, the Bible is made up of, as I think Jordan Peterson refers to it, the Bible's not a book, it's a library of books. In a time of, 2,000 years ago, how did all these men come together to make this one book? Or did it take 500 years to create the Bible what it is today?
That's a great question. I'm not super accurate with it, but I'll put you in the ballpark. The Jewish Bible, which has changed over time, but the Jewish Bible at the time of Christ, I think was something around 1,000 years. It's disputed. I know that. But from the start, the first book of the Bible, which would be Genesis, all the way through to now this is going to get speculatory. This is where Protestants and Catholics and Eastern Orthodox have a disagreement on the Jewish canon, the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament. There's like this 400-year period that Protestants reject. But at the time, there was a bunch of books that were accepted. At the time of Christ, there was a bunch of books that were accepted and in use by Christians that we would claim is in the Bible. That the Jews later, like 2 centuries later, said, no, we don't accept those as scriptures. But I wouldn't follow the Jews 200 years after Christ. I would follow what was in use by the Christians at the time of Christ, which would be the Catholic argument. So I think the first book to the last book was somewhere around 1,000 years, potentially more, for the Old Testament. And then the New Testament, I think it's written over about, I want to say 150 something years, maybe a bit more. And that's from, obviously, maybe not obviously, the Old Testament is written, the first 5 books is also known as the Pentateuch or something like that, which is the law, the Jewish law. And then there's a bunch of books that are like the prophets, which tells the story of, like, it's an unfolding story as you go. And the first 5 books are things like the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, the story of Moses, the Exodus from Egypt, all this kind of stuff to the Promised Land. And then once they get settled in the Promised Land, the prophets start to come, and the prophets tell different predictions or prophecies for the future of the Messiah, the coming Messiah. And there's a lot of them. And then when you get to the New Testament, it starts with the Gospels, which is the life of Jesus as told by 4 different people. And then you have the Acts, this one here, the Acts, the letters, and Revelation. Revelation is right at the end. So those prophecies that were foretold in the Old Testament, This is really good. Actually, I watched a video on this just recently. Shout out to Joe Heschmeyer from Catholic Answers. He's a Catholic apologist. He talks about Psalm 22. I'm going to butcher this. But Psalm 22 in the Old Testament, which was written like 500 BC or something like that, predicts crucifixion of the Messiah, saying that he would be pierced through the hands and feet. And crucifixion wasn't known when that was written. So that's one of about 300 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. And there's all sorts of arguments that, that could. So the answer would be, well, how many other Messiah claimers? Because there was a lot of people that were like, I'm the Messiah, follow me. Which nobody remembers any one of them. And the Jews rejected him. None of those other claimants were crucified. So this one prophecy points to Jesus, because Jesus was somebody who claimed himself to be the Messiah, somebody who had a big following that all pointed to him as this is the Messiah, who was crucified. And then, as we spoke about, the followers stayed. They didn't disperse after he was killed. And yeah, Christianity spread, etc. But yeah, so essentially this prophecy was written that his hands and feet would be pierced. Or the word is like dug or excavated, but it's also used for an awl or a piercing through the ear in the same Jewish Bible, which we would say is an ear pierced. So it would be the same thing as piercing the hands and feet, which is done in the crucifixion, which is not even known about at the time that it was written. So it's one prophecy out of 300, and this is that convergence of evidence. How can people prophesize what's going to happen in the future on so many different layers? Like that prophecy on its own is certainly not compelling, but it is somewhat compelling on a lower level. And when you have another 200, 300 plus building on top of that, plus all the martyrs, all the saints, the Catholic Church, the priests and bishops, the spread of Christianity, all of the rights that come out of Christianity, human rights, all of the, I guess, natural law, common law, the legal system in the Western world that all come out of Christianity. It's all like this convergence of evidence and connects with our conscience, which we would call the Aboriginal Vicar of Christ. So yeah, hopefully I made a point there.
Yep. And I guess there's been, again, like many modifications of the Bible. The Catholic one still stands strong today, as would you say the Bible that most people refer to?
You definitely could say that, but I don't think, like, social proof matters, but I don't think it ultimately matters. I think that, people can be, how we talked about original sin, this propensity to do, for want of a better word, evil, this propensity to do things that are not ultimately good. And I would say that seeking the truth is a good, which is interesting when you talk about the scientific principles. It has a belief system that to seek the truth would be good, which is a belief. It's not science, even though it underpins science. And if you look where science come from, it come out of Christian societies because it needs that belief, which not all societies had. But sorry, put me back on point. We're talking about
the Catholic Bible being the most.
Yes. The Catholic Bible being the most pointed to or the most accepted. I just think it's got the best version and historical telling of why we give the Bible precedence, like primacy. Like if you come at the Bible and you say, well, I believe in sola scriptura, the Bible is the ultimate book and you have to believe what it's said in it, what is said within it. Well, the obvious pushback to that is why? How can we rely on this Bible? Why these scriptures? Why not other scriptures? And that's a very plausible question. It's a good question. It has a massive history of disputes. All I would say is follow that answer to its conclusion all the way. Don't go with what you want, because we talked about this concupiscence or original sin. I want to be the authority in my life. I want to read that Bible and interpret it my way. I don't want to have to bow down to someone else's interpretation. If I want to get divorced like King Henry, I want that Bible to say, I'm getting divorced. That's very natural to human nature. So I fully understand the propensity to reject authority other than yourself, but I don't think that that's good for you, and I don't think that that's true. And I think you have to allow for that in your search for which Bible is the correct or has the fullness of truth is probably the more accurate way to say it. Because at the end of the day, I think you're asking about like lost doctrines and scriptures and stuff like that. 100% that's plausible that the early Christians had access to spoken word that we might not have access to today, that didn't get preserved through history. But faith, we would take it on as an act of faith that the Holy Spirit or God the Father has led the church in faithfulness to preserve what's prudential or what's needed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I don't know how you can prove that kind of thing. What did people know 2,000 years ago? If we don't have written records, that's lost.
I want to come back to marriage and talk about what are the roles of the male and the female marriage.
From a biblical perspective, and this is, I don't know how much of this is canon law or Catholic law and how much of this is just my own traditional view. Because obviously within Catholic law, they don't specifically define every single thing rigidly. Some things are rigidly defined, but not every single thing is rigidly defined. But this is probably just my personal interpretation, but I'm very confident that it is, for want of a better word, kosher. Like it fits within an allowable perspective. I think that the male should be the head of the household. The Bible says things like, I'd have to look it up. You put me on the spot. But there's a verse talking about how the man should love his wife as Christ loved the church. And there's a lot in that. The way that I interpret that is that Christ is the head of the church. But the way that Christ loved the church was to give his entire life for the good of the church, for the good of all of humanity, for the good of Christians. Does that make sense? So it's not I'm the head of the household and I rule with an iron fist and what I say goes, but it's hopefully in love I can make prudential decisions that are beneficial for my wife and myself. But I certainly would not ever encourage someone to discredit their wife or reject their wife's position, because if you'd ever do that, you'd have to do it out of love, and you'd have to really discern and be very cautious about doing that, because you can easily trick yourself into thinking, I know better. That's that propensity for doing the wrong thing. And there is another verse about how a wife should treat their husband. I can't remember off the top of my head. We should probably link that or look it up, maybe edit that in. Very important. I think it's wives submit to your husband as the church submits to Christ or something like that. It might not be very accurate there, but there is a line there. But the bottom line is you don't want to set up this rigid, I'm the boss and you're the slave and you do what I say, because that's absolutely the opposite of what I'm interpreting it as. But it is, like we said, I guess, in the Catholic belief system, there is an authority that is making decisions and binding us to things that are for our good. And if we disagree with the Pope or the magisterium or the councils of the bishops that have all come together and defined something, if I personally disagree with them, then I'm likely wrong. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And hopefully what they've defined, this is our belief, what they've defined, even if I disagree with it, is good for me. And that's what the goal would be. And you wouldn't, they don't define everything, and they don't try to define things that don't need to be defined. So if I can give my wife grace to make her own decisions and have her own role and autonomy, I should. So very few times am I putting my foot down. Does that make sense? Very few times. Yeah. So I don't think that that is the only way to do things, but I guess it's a very sore topic and it's easily abused. So it's not something that very many men like to promote, because we've all seen history where people in power abuse their power. And we definitely don't want to encourage that ever. But at the end of the day, if there's only two people and we're doing this 50-50 thing, and I disagree with you and I can't convince you, and you disagree with me and you can't convince me, if it's a very important issue, how do we go beyond that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely the way society seems to be going. Like everyone wants a 50-50 trade-off, and if not, the opposing side or one side gets upset about it.
Yeah, and it's super hard to defer authority to someone else. Like it's not a good feeling for most people. It's not easy to do that, which is why I said a lot of people struggle being Catholic, because I've got to defer to my priest, to my bishop, to the Pope in certain matters, you know? And that's biblical as well. You know, if you take a matter, it says if two people disagree, take it to a few other witnesses, like Christians. So get like a jury kind of concept. And if they still can't agree, take it to the church. And if they disagree with the church, treat them like heathens, kick them out. Treat them like tax collectors and pagans. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if we can't come to an agreement and it's 50-50, what are we to do? If it's an important issue, like a critical issue, what are we to do? And I would say, well, we can go, what I just said, we can take it to the church and they can help us mediate and discern. But you can't break that symmetry how do you break that symmetry in a 50-50 relationship? I want this, I want that. Okay, well, you do you. Now there's a divide between us. And ultimately, we want to be one flesh. We want to be in agreement. That doesn't mean that you can't have your own opinion on certain things and all that sort of stuff. But certainly on important issues, like if I think something's going to send, like this is Catholic law and it's going to send you to hell if you break it, and you think, nah, it's fine, I can do what I want, we can't really agree to disagree in my faith, right? And if you don't have a faith and you have your own view of the world, there's certainly going to be beliefs that you do hold. And this could be as simple as monogamy. Like maybe, you know, the world is a crazy world and some people are promoting polygamy now. Do you know what I mean? Like, and if you're in a relationship with someone and they think it's okay to be polygamous and you don't, and you're in a 50-50 relationship, this is an extreme example, but there'd be a massive spectrum of other issues that would be extremely important that you might not be able to agree to disagree on. We have to come to an agreement, but we disagree. So how do we get there? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. What do you think, like, the biggest reason for divorce is? Do you think it's because we look back 100 years, the father went to work, the mother stayed home, raised the family, cooked the meals, cleaned. That, as much as many people would disagree with that seemed to be a very more rational civilization in time.
Man, those questions are huge. There's so many points that I want to make there, but I want to be very clear and say that I've butted heads with people within the church that I won't name that are great people and have authority over me. And I think it's very easy to be overly harsh in response to feminism. And I think that would be detrimental. I don't want to do that. I think women are beautiful and need to be protected and should be loved and cherished. And I believe in the feminine genius, and I believe femininity is absolutely spectacular. So I really want to give a lot of grace to females. But I think feminism is a difficult one to define. So you could see it as two separate trees with different fruit on them. But if I draw out particular points within feminism without attacking the whole thing, I certainly think there are false beliefs, and I certainly think that there's many, many of them in our culture that have kind of been snuck in with that kind of movement that are very detrimental both to women and men and humanity as a whole. And I think it goes against the church's view of complementarity of the genders, of the sexes. I think my wife brings a great deal to my life, and I think she does things that I could never do, and she's an absolute blessing, and I cherish her. And I think she certainly deserves equal dignity to me, but we're not the same, and I certainly don't want the same things as her. And I can't speak for all men, but I can certainly say it's much more natural for men to feel dignity from providing and working hard and kind of breaking their bodies to provide for their family. And I think this is borne out in social data. Men are much more likely to do dangerous or heavy jobs, to work overtime, to live away in horrible places and do horrible jobs in order to gain financial advantage. And women are much less likely to do that, especially over a long period of prolonged time. And that's not to say that many women aren't hardworking, but in general, they're not wanting to do hard physical labor, 12-hour shifts, night shifts, day shifts. And if they are wanting to do that, they don't feel greatly fulfilled by doing it. Some men don't either. But the point I want to get across is a couple of things. I am against, and this is Catholic teaching, so it shouldn't be a surprise, I'm against the whole abortion thing, and that's a personal choice. And I think there's a lot of quote unquote women's rights that get smuggled into that debate or that political position. And I don't mean to be rough on it. I know it's brutal. And I don't want to condemn anyone, but I would hope to work in love slowly with the people that are on the other side of the fence in discussion to kind of come to an agreement on that, because I think in the discussion, it's not just a man and a woman, but it's the child in the discussion. And I think scientifically, life begins at conception. And I think if you're going to give humans rights, the first right is life. And if a human right is life, then human life starts at conception. Then how do you not consider that child's life in the womb? How do you not treat them as a human? And in the discussion around that, I don't want to get too much into it, but you can kind of get where I'm going with it. So I think that that is not necessarily a woman's right. I think that there's a lot more to be said on that issue, and it's a super delicate issue, and I'm trying to not upset anyone, but I also have to speak truth to that. The other thing that I want to talk about is the work. I think that there's this belief, and you're spot on, there's this belief that men and women are the same, and we're definitely not the same. And it's kind of this contradiction in our society here where, you know, for example, let's say we're going to talk about being a fitter, like a pipe fitter or a mechanical fitter, heavy labor job at like heavy industry. And I can talk about like a specific thing. It's not like a hypothetical thing. Say I'm at heavy industry and I'm a male fitter, and to get that job, I had to do a medical, and the medical was designed so that when I do the job, I can perform daily tasks that involve significant manual labor, heavy lifting. And in that medical, I've got to lift a 40 kilogram object, like an awkward object, up off the floor, carry it to a shelf, put it on a shelf above shoulder level. It's quite difficult to do. And you have to do it a certain amount of times, and you have to take it off the shelf and move it further down, put it on the shelf in another place. So every man that got a job on that industrial site had to do that 40 kilo weight. And then that company got a quota where they needed to get X percentage of people, employees on that site as women, as part of this kind of equality kind of concept. But then immediately, to get the women in the door, they changed the medical. Men still had to do that same medical, but women had to do a different medical with lighter weight. Now, that's a lie. Either the medical fits the role or it doesn't. So if I've got to lift heavy parts on the job, then I need to lift heavy parts in the medical. Or if I don't have to lift heavy parts on the job, does that make sense? It's got to be the same medical for all genders. And, you could make an argument, but that's too heavy. Nobody should have to lift that. But that is the job. And I've worked on that site, and you had to lift really heavy things in awkward positions not all days, but many days. So then a bunch of women got employed with a lesser medical, with lesser strength. And what happened then in those daily tasks, you used to get jobs where you were always sent out in a pair, like two fitters sent out together to do a certain task. And many of those tasks, the woman wasn't strong enough to do, and which made the job take longer, which make the men do more physical work, the women do less. That's not equality. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. It's like, well, I believe 100% equal dignity. I believe in merit. If they can do the job, like some women are really strong and there's no issue at all. And if you get a really strong woman that wants to be a fitter, that can do the medical, 100%, I got no issue with that. And I don't want to put all women in a box. Some women do want to do heavy manual labor and work heavy, loud, dirty, sweaty jobs, but not very many. And if they do, just get them to do the same medical as required for the role. And then I think when you do quotas, you can't rely on merit anymore. There's like an injustice to the quota, and it's difficult to articulate, but essentially the concept is if the right amount of people are not in the job, say we assume this concept that women are being unfairly prejudiced against and they're not being given a fair chance at the job because the people that are in the interviewing process prefer men or have this belief that men can do the job better. That's unfounded. That's bad. We don't want that. I agree if that is proven that we don't want that. We want it to be just on merit alone. But what you find is who can correct for that? How can you measure that and how can you correct for that? Maybe you could put different people in the interview process with different belief systems, but they still need to meet the same criteria. And when you start trying to correct for a belief system that you're asserting, where's the evidence for it? Like, how can you say, well, heaps of women would prefer to be fitters and heaps of women have the ability to do the job, so we're going to put a quota on it, 30% of women at this place, just to prove that we believe in equality. That's kind of now disconnected from the original belief. So yeah, there's kind of an injustice in that. Am I making a point there?
100%. There's definitely one statement made by a particular man who's well known, but not very well respected. Like I'm thinking, Andrew Tate, just put it out there. A lot of what he says is quite ridiculous, but one point he did make was the idea of, I guess, certain roles are for certain genders, you can say, more so. I guess the idea of when you take your kids to daycare, you would probably opt for the carers to be female opposed to male.
Yep.
And then there's definitely jobs that you would opt for them to be more male dominated than female.
Yeah. Jordan Peterson has a really good statement on this, and he talks about the social data. And in countries that are more egalitarian, meaning more everyone gets opportunity to do whatever they want, what you find is that the women do more women things and the men do more men things. Obviously, that's not everyone. We're not trying to make it rigid and only this person and this gender can do this job, but it becomes more that way. And, you know, you could talk about, basically what we've talked about. The truth is men have a propensity to do certain things because they get more satisfaction and they're more suited to it. Now, I'm not saying all men, most men, and same thing for women. And you could talk about customer service, you could talk about nursing roles, you could talk about oil drilling rigs, you could talk about, you can kind of get what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
So that's one problem where we kind of get this idea that men and women are the same, and that we're absolutely not the same. And to be a man is very different to be a woman, but there is obviously a spectrum within each one. So you're not forced into doing certain things, but you are very likely to do them. Much, much more likely. So yeah, that's the problem that you have, is when things are being kind of forced or pushed that create an injustice or an unfairness to the process. Obviously, that just worsens things. So if you can imagine that hypothetical I gave you about the mechanical fitter, the men in that role are experiencing some level of injustice every day. And that makes it harder to have a dignified relationship with the opposite genders, because the reality is that they're doing more work, heavier work, not the same work. And they're, you know, you go back to the boss and the boss is like, well, why wasn't the job done on time? And you're like, well, I had to do all the heavy lifting. And there's, you know, when it's two men that can do it, that can lift heavy. I guess it's a stereotype. Don't get me wrong. I've already put the criteria on it. But in general, when there's women coming through that didn't do the medical of lifting 40 kilos, and maybe you're on a job that doesn't require that, but when you are on a job that does require that, which is why the medical was set in the first place and is still held to that level for men, it makes the job take longer. And then the boss is like, now we're behind schedule. The man is getting pressure from the top, which is like, this isn't fair. What's going on? So I don't like any of those sorts of things. Obviously, things have to be just. And if they can do the job and they can meet the requirements and they want to do it, I'm happy to give them a go. But in most cases, most women don't enjoy that role. That particular industry is extremely loud, you know, earplugs all day, sometimes double earplugs, extremely dirty, dust in the air everywhere. A lot of times you got to wear breathing apparatus, and it's extremely hot. There's heat radiating off all of the industrial things around you all day, and some of that heat is 50 plus degrees. You're out in the sun all the time, heavy lifting. It's not pleasant unless you enjoy extreme physical exertion. So
it's definitely tricky. And unfortunately, I feel a lot of women only take those roles is because, one, they feel forced to, and two, because there's obviously some financial benefit to doing those hard labor jobs, but that's why you are paid well, because it's a very difficult job that very few people want to do.
Yeah. And if you only do part of that job and you get full pay, it's not fair. Does that make sense?
100%.
And that's what gets at people. And I don't think, and this kind of comes back to my position in Christianity, we believe in truth. And I don't think that telling the lie of these women need to go through this medical, which is a really low bar, and these men need to go through this, which is a really high bar, that there's an inherent lie there, which is you should just create the medical that fits the job, and everyone that gets the job should go through the same medical. Otherwise, it's unjust. bottom line, right? Otherwise you're lying. And whenever you create a lie to push a particular belief, you're not on the right path.
Switching subjects to coming back to more of a Christian, I guess, topic. This is a journey that you're already on and will be continuing to, trial and error as you go. But I guess when you have kids, how do you introduce them to the church?
It's a good question. I think it's already in our daily rhythm. So my wife and I go to church every week. My daughter comes with us. And that's going to be the case for as long as we can. And yeah, I guess I don't have a very strict plan. I'm at the very start of that journey, and I will definitely look to other men in the faith for guidance and wisdom. There's plenty of very impressive families that I know of that are Catholic that are doing what seems like a great job. But I will certainly be handing on my wisdom to my children and not letting them figure it out for themselves. And I think if I was to let them figure it out for themselves, it would be doing an injustice to them. I feel like, why wouldn't you teach your children the benefits that you've learned? So, obviously we don't want to go too heavy or too deep when they're too young. We want to make it age appropriate. And you want to do every step in love, not like forcing them or being too overly judicial or overly punitive or anything like that. It's got to be joy, really.
One problem is a lot of adults today were born into Catholic families or Christian families. They had religion forced upon them, as they, I guess, say. Religion was forced on them, and they never wanted to contribute to, or becoming faithful to God. And then over the years, it's because they felt like it was forced into them, it actually pushed them away from wanting to follow through with Christ. And I guess the example I like to give is when you try to force a kid to eat vegetables, right? Always going to be hesitant to it. So I guess how do you, again, like this is something that you might not actually know the answer to, but I guess what do you think could potentially be a way to avoid that from happening, where you're not almost forcing them, but you're more so taking the, how would you put it? You're taking the angle of you're trying to show them what the right way is without making them want to become hesitant.
There's a few things there. So number one is, I think in general, when they're young, they don't know what's best for them. So when they're young, you can do it in a way that is working with them, but ultimately it's your decision as a parent to do what's right for your kids. And obviously for me as a Catholic, taking them to church is right. So it's just about going about it in a way where you can make it fun, you can make it light, you can make it bonding. You're in relationship with your children and in relationship with God and helping them develop a relationship with the Catholic faith, which is, in depth. You can connect with them on a empathetic level or games or depending on their age, right? But I think the key to what you're saying is as children get older, they all come to a point, different personalities are different, but most of them will come to a point in their teenage years where they start to become way more curious and inquisitive, and they're looking for their own answers. And I think when they go through those teenage years, sometimes you could get a little bit of a rebellious streak, is to foster a relationship with your child where they are open to getting your advice and open to asking you deep questions. So if your children are asking you deep questions about the faith that are challenging, sometimes you might not even know the answer. I hope that I have the wisdom to go and find the answer rather than be dismissive or angry at being challenged. So hopefully I can develop a relationship with my kids by the time they hit their teens, that they can come to me and ask me questions. And if I don't know the answer, we'll go find it together. Because the beauty of the church is there's so much information and it's so tested and time proven that someone will have the answer. Because for 2,000 years, people have been asking questions all over the world in 1 billion strong. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I want to have that open dialogue with the kids, and I want to reward them for being curious and seeking answers, not discouraging. Is that the value, that the place that I see? And I know exactly what you're talking about. I know a lot of kids that were raised Catholic, but were never like really taught the depth of the faith. It was kind of like just surface level. There's actually a guy I'm friends with recently who's come back to the church, that was into the church as a kid and then was an atheist for a long time, and then has just recently come back to the faith. And I think the way to, sometimes you can't stop it. You know, God works in his own way, and sometimes certain personality traits or certain experiences in their life, they need to go on their own path. But I think a good ward away from that kind of trouble is to have that open, curious relationship where it's like, that's a good question. I love the way you're thinking there. Let's go find the answer together. Or maybe I've got good answers and I can, like I do with you quite often, you ask a question, I give like a surface answer, and then I ask you probing questions to make you think deeper or think in a certain avenue. And hopefully I can do that with my kids when they get at that age, because you want them to, do you want to give them the tools and the attitude to go find the answers and know where to look, know how to get them?
100%. Much more you want to delve into anything, any specific topics, you think?
I think you were talking to me before when we had that cut about something that was pretty important.
In regards to wealth?
Yeah, there was something else that I wanted to say about suffering. And I think, you know, when we go back to the original question about why Catholicism, why religion at all, I think the modern day culture that says that the good life or the thing that you should strive for is kind of comfort and pleasure. I think if you observe the world and the regular daily life, there's a lot of evidence that says that's not the ultimate good. And it's for this reason. Beautiful things like having children pull you away from comfort and pleasure. And it wouldn't make sense that the world works in a way where the ultimate good works against the penultimate good, if you can get what I'm getting at. So penultimate, I mean second best. So the best, so say like everything should be vertically aligned. So like your faith should help you to be a good parent. Your faith should help you to be a good husband. Your faith should help you to be a good employee. Your belief system should go together in one pathway that converges in one point rather than fight against each other. So if I think the best thing that I can do in my life is to feel really good and consume a bunch of things and, you know, eat all the tasty stuff and do all the tasty things and see all the beautiful stuff and experiences. But if I have a kid, then I can't do a bunch of things and it's going to be more about them and they're going to have all these needs and demands and they're going to cost me a lot of money, so I'm not going to be able to afford much. See how that kind of clashes up against each other? And I think that belief system is what's leading a lot of young people to say, I don't want to have kids until I'm at least 30. Because in their mind, they're like,
I want to experience life and travel. And
I want to do all of these goods. But the reality is the belief that seeking pleasure and comfort and feel-good experiences is not anywhere near the ultimate good and is not, don't get me wrong, it's still a good. It's still good to be comfortable and feel pleasure sometimes, but it has to be very constrained within a regimented discipline, and within other things that are way more important than that in the hierarchy, right? And the same thing with the end. So children is butting that right in the head. And the same thing with the end of our lives. Most people will go through severe struggles in their life, whether that's health or mental or physical or accidents or extreme tragedy in their life of some emotional or physical sense. So it's kind of like there's a lot of suffering and pain inbuilt in the usual life. And some of those things are really good. Some of those things you might see as not that good. But certainly children bring a lot of joy, but a lot of responsibility. And I think with a proper belief system, you can be open to children and say, this is an absolute blessing. And I'm so grateful to have this responsibility in my life. But if you're seeking pleasure and comfort, it's very difficult to do that. And yeah, I just want to push people on, have your beliefs congruent. Like all your beliefs should be together and working towards a singular point where the ultimate good is. And I think in your belief system, you have to at least agree that existence itself, being alive, is good. Because if you don't have that, everything's a pretty bleak downhill road. And people struggle with that. I know atheists. I have people that I'm relatively close with that are atheists that struggle with that nihilistic depression. And obviously those beliefs can't be true. Otherwise, and I guess this leads me to a point that I love, because you asked me originally why Catholicism as opposed to other religions. And I think this concept of good and evil is in a lot of religions, but a lot of religions say that they're equal forces, whereas the Christian religion says that good is the winner. Like, it's good news. The good side wins in the end. And I feel like that is true. If you have them as equals, it doesn't make sense to me if they are fully equal, because then ultimately it's very difficult for me to articulate right now, but I guess I could probably link in the description to a really good video on that. The other thing I want to bring up is what I see as a very big barrier to believing in religion is the problem of evil. And I find talking to a lot of people, they're like, well, how could a all-powerful, all-good God exist when we see so much evil in the world? You could say suffering. And what I would say is 100%, that is a challenging question. The first caveat that I would give is, regardless of religion, regardless of God, that evil or suffering, or however you want to describe it, is there. So you can remove all the beliefs that the religious people have. You still got to deal with the problem of evil. Rejecting religion does not reject the problem of evil at any level. So how would you explain it without religion? And that's a very challenging question. But what else I would say is that original sin explains a lot of that. The concept of concupiscence and this fall of man and this temptation to sin explains a lot of personal evil where men are doing bad things to other men. And then there's natural evils, which are things like hurricanes and disease and stuff like that. And that's brutal, and it can be a little bit more difficult to explain. But I think what goes part of the way to explaining it is that God created a rational world where certain things have to be in certain places at certain times, and everything kind of has to fit together and make sense. Things aren't randomly popping in and out of existence and kind of disconnected from everything else. Everything's connected. And that connectedness comes with consequences. So, for example, for the earth to continually renew and the tectonic plates shift creates volcanoes, and for the temperature to be having seasons and the plants to grow creates certain wind problems and tidal issues and rain issues. So what I'm saying is a lot of that natural evil, if you want to say it like that, is just consequences of living in a rational world, which I feel like makes a lot of sense to me. Some people, they might still reject that, but it goes a long way for me. So I would say those two things, right? Original sin and living in a rational world explain a bunch of it. And if you reject those things, you still have to deal with the problem of evil, even if you reject God. And finally, what I would say is I know a few people that are angry at the world, are angry at their circumstances, which whether they would admit it or not, they certainly probably wouldn't admit it, but it makes them resentful to God. So they reject God on that grounds alone. I can't believe in God because things haven't gone well for me. Does that make sense? And I definitely feel empathy for those people. I know life can have a lot of challenges and can make you feel, broken. But I would say the way out of that is not resentment. The resentment leads down, not up. And I would say forgiveness is a concept through Christianity. A second chance, redemption, is a concept through Christianity. So try to, I would say, challenge those people. How are you going to get out of this bitterness predicament? And is what you're missing really a pill? Because that's where most of these people that they're bitter and resentful about their situation, they have mental health issues, they go get, chemical help, which I'm not saying is always wrong, but I'm saying that sometimes our beliefs can make that kind of push us in that direction because we're being prideful and resentful. Because to blame God is in some way inherently saying, if I was God, I would have done it better. It's to kind of claim that I know better than God. And I get it. I get why they go that way, because sometimes you feel really jaded and like the world's not been fair to you. But you've got to find a way out of that loop. And if you're holding on to beliefs that are holding you in that loop, sometimes the first thing you've got to do is let go of that blame, that hatred, that resentment, and find forgiveness. And I think the easiest, most congruent story for that is Christianity. Hopefully I've made some points there.
100%. I guess it is one thing that people question, like, if God is real, why am I suffering so much? Why have I been dealt these cards? Why hasn't he helped me through these hard times? And I guess, could you make the point that God will guide us? The one saying that I go off is, God will steer the boat, but you must row. That's one that I live by.
Yeah. So this is such a difficult subject, but what I want to say is a couple of things. So to that saying that you just said, I would say that God gives grace in his own measures to individuals in his own way. Sometimes we miss those opportunities because we're resentful or we're rejecting them. We're not open to them. And sometimes there's other reasons, like we're a bit too lazy to get out and take those opportunities. Or we're just focusing on the pain too much. The other thing that I want to say is, if you look at Christ's story, like let's just talk about the Christian story. We believe that God became man, walked the earth, and what did he do while he was here? Well, he done a bunch of miracles, but not to enrich himself, but to help everyone else. And ultimately, he did things that he knew would lead to his complete chastisement, public torture, public hatred, and death. But he did things that he knew were good for those people around him. So he suffered an immensely painful, torturous, prolonged death in public, being humiliated as God by choice for the good of everyone else. So, like I said, we can learn from stories and we can learn from nature. If you accept that Christian story, there's a lot of, that's a mystery of why that would happen and how. And then why would God do that? unless there is some sort of redemptive quality in suffering, there is some, and he says in the Bible, like, pick up your cross and follow me. Well, what is he saying? Picking up your cross is an instrument of torture. So he's saying, don't be afraid to suffer. And don't be afraid to suffer for others, which is, I'm a new parent. I can relate to that. Staying up late at night, being woken up, being sleep deprived for the benefit of my child is suffering for others. So that's kind of inherent in the basic life. It's also, we all do it, you know. Hopefully we do it for others, but even for ourselves, it's like you suffer to be fit, you suffer to be healthy all the time. You suffer to have a good relationship. To have a good relationship with my wife, I can't just think about what I want all the time. I have to always consider her and try to do things that are for her good as often as I can. And it's kind of at the heart of everything. You can't live for yourself. So I think the Christian story has suffering inherent to it. And it says, don't turn your back on suffering. Voluntarily pick your cross up and suffer for the good of everyone else. And I think in doing so, it has some redemptive quality. And obviously, you've got to cooperate with God's grace. We can do nothing on our own. And you should be in the rhythm of the church, in the liturgical rhythm, subordinate to the Catholic teaching, Catholic priests, bishops, Pope. It all makes sense when you put all of the different pieces of evidence together, and it would heal so many people's sufferings that I know of, if only they could accept it. And I know it's not easy to accept. It took me years of searching, but it took me many years or decades before that searching the rest of the world, and I didn't find any answers that went close.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to end the podcast.
Cool.
I always appreciate your wisdom, brother, and I'll know there will be many more episodes to come, and hopefully have to get Ash and others back together for another full-way conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and hopefully I've made some sense at some stage. Thanks, brother.